Hi everyone, David Orlando again. It's hard to believe 2 weeks or 2 months have gone by, and this project is or this class is almost over. But time flies, I guess. So I guess just start going over this project and the process flow that it's gone through is really I'll go through it week by week. For the first project or the first project document, we went through really a proposal. I mean, it was really a concept of operations and design and how we would kind of set up the planning phase for this, how to best optimize profits, and how we would kind of strategically set up this business's use case for bike sharing platform. We went through, or I went through, um, how to like assess what locations would be best, what the different payment types that would be available, and then the logical connections between like the use cases of the payments and how it would align to the information system. I also touched in mine on the physical auditing, some of the maintenance, and some of the risks that might be associated. And really, those were kind of foreshadowing for the next steps in the project. For the second week, that's when I went into more of a formal design, and we had a design layout that really showed how all the different pieces of the conceptual system and how its architecture was connected. This moved on to an itemized breakdown of each component, what it was, how it fits into the architecture workflow. And with mine, I proposed more of an on-premise design. I left cloud as an optional backup, but I think an on-premise cloud setup in the end run can be a bit cheaper depending on how you manage it. And if you do it correctly, it leaves a lot more versatility for scaling on your own accord or optimizing what licensing and whatnot that you use. Cloud platforms are better and better at that, but it's almost like the larger purchase plans allow for different itemization and customization like that, where smaller sample spaces of compute resources really limit, you end up purchasing a bit more than you ever even utilize, or you get more licensing that you need. And a lot of agencies in recent years have found that it's ends up being more expensive, which is something that a lot of companies that I've worked with didn't really expect. Um, so in week two, we went over what equipment was needed, what companies or vendors might need to be reached out to, and just overall outline for being able for me to build the system. Week three, I jumped into security. Um, I'd say when I say security, I mean security overall, and this is kind of risk management, which works towards operational security, process security, and system security. Um, so cybersecurity was definitely a part of it, and I went over the different security controls per each device that would need to be involved, but also an operational kind of workflow of what that security looks like from system to system and from each person's task that's going to take part in this information system and how to secure that. There was also a focus on physical security because doing proper audits, having proper locking mechanisms, and making sure that this equipment is evaluated for functionality and that there's um, not a risk for really like a damage or somebody getting hurt that could lead to a legal like a liability. That's a big problem. And then really this you kind of I generally want to go overkill with this kind of document because really you go over every security control that you could have and then you scale back or set it up that acquiesces the company's preferences and the balance between operations and security, and then what's feasibly financially. Because sometimes when you're too secure, it hurts you. It becomes cost prohibitive to be that secure in the system. So for week four, um, became more practical and realistic, where we designed an entire workflow of the business requirements for each use case for kind of the billing schema that they wanted to use, and went over each logical step of the information system and how it would be, utilized in an itemized workflow, given a customer does a rental, and then what each step and what software attributes would be involved to guide the system's database and backend functionality and actually doing a rental. Also in this week, I created a sample code that you could actually use as an example for a customer, saying like, this is what this would look like when it's plugged in, and we needed that code to function properly, at least as an example. So whenever we start building the system out, we already have some of those pieces built in. So for week 5, we detailed I detailed the project database attributes that were really kind of alluded to in the previous week 4, and this includes, the users, the bikes, the stations, the rentals, and how that data is structured and detailed. And this really gives a tangible way to plug in all those attributes and their object names into a working code workflow and into a relational database, and really guides the way the information system would work from, a practical application, and really provides those connector points from that you need for system to system integration. I also designated the potential data types for each of these, um, but I think that typically those tend to change a little bit over time. Some of them stay the same, but once you get into the actual, like, I guess, implementation phase, it's surprising how many of these change from what you project and what you end up doing. Um, so week 6 was kind of the second half in my mind to what was started in week 5, um, where I effectively designed or defined an attribute workflow that used the attributes from the previous week in a system process example, where it's using the information system to carry out a rental event. So basically, it's these attributes arranged under each system object and then tied into the workflow, where each of those attributes are called to be able to complete the task. And then, we or I provided an SQL statements that would function as a script to, complete the given function. So this one is needed because it really shows where you would utilize the different attributes, where those attributes would exist in the database and each of the corresponding systems. Um, and it's a little bit more on the database side of it versus like an API or integration standpoint, which did come, next in the week after. So for week 7, it was really combining all of these different documents that we did previously and putting them together into a deployment and implementation plan. In my experience, sometimes you'll do one of two things. One, you'll start with kind of the document we did in week 1, and that'll lead to this document that we did in week 7. Or in certain use cases and certain agencies and what they require for a proposal, you may even start with what we presented in week 7, or what we're kind of talking to today, for the actual proposal for a project. And that's kind of your last step before, the project starts or the company or agency makes an award to, give you the chance to be able to do this type of work. So for the last part of this presentation, the steps to really kick off this project, I like to arrange them in 3 areas, and there could be a 4th, but I'm going to do 3 for today to keep this a little bit short. Is first, hardware. You really need to do location surveys, do traffic data, and really find where the best optimal place to put these stations are. Based on the numbers of stations, we can do pricing and get a bill of materials to go over the licensing, the purchasing, the shipments, how they're going to be installed and where they're going to be installed, and then ultimately the internet connection, which is going to be cellular. You can start doing projections of throughput to kind of gauge how many bikes that we might cycle through, or what the operation and maintenance costs of this system would be. And then once we start, having that data, you can actually even start putting together compute resource requirements, because the amount of rental transactions and everything that goes through is how much, the backend system's being utilized. That's how much computer resources or storage that you need. Next, backup and restore components to make sure this is resilient comes into play. And then you can start touching on the physical security controls, like the bike locking mechanism, making sure the kiosk device isn't stolen, that kind of thing. Next, for software, for each piece of hardware rather, you really end up with kind of a corresponding piece of software, which includes licensing most of the time, that needs to be acquired. This will also go into the bill of material because it's a purchasable item. The setup of software workflows for the bike stations to the kiosks to the internet connection to the back office, and then how that ties into the bike sharing software is really a design that needs to start being built out when you're doing software acquisition, because not all programs work together natively and not all programs can be directly connected even with an API easily. And the more difficult that is, and the more that it hasn't been tried and true in the past, the more development costs that you may end up with. And that can get very expensive very quickly. So it's something that needs to be planned out. The security controls for each piece of software can start being looked at. And actually, that's when you start making a decision based on each component of the system, what security controls at what degree of depth that you want to apply to each of them. This is where, you make a decision. Do we need to apply STIG controls to the printer? Probably not for a system like this, but that is a question that comes up whenever you're taking steps to ensure that this system is secured and isn't hacked tomorrow, and then you've lost all the revenue to be able to implement it. Establishing the database structure, we did a good part of this in the week's assignments, but really building that out to the next, like, second and even third level is the next step that needs to happen even before the deployment does. Getting all this equipment in and having to go through how they're all going to tie together after the fact becomes very problematic, and at least having a way forward on what systems are going to be able to communicate in which way. It's very similar to making sure that you don't need too many APIs, but it's also a little bit different, saying these are our attributes, these are our objects virtually, and this is how it's logically going to flow, and what relational factors we have between each system. For the next category, I think processes and procedures. We're really going through a purchasing plan and how you're going to set up the fee methods and how we're going to set up warranties is a big piece of it. And then the automation of the system, what systems can work together automatically, what's going to require manual input, what's going to require human intervention, and then the workarounds, which is something that's constantly forgotten. The workarounds for each of those steps is very necessary. And then the installation process for new stations, the upgrade of old stations, and then really all the different, I guess, approval processes that go in with doing it from the root company needs to be established. And then really all the protocols, audits, maintenance tasks, and regular, inspections of the system to make sure everything works properly, functions correctly, and that there's no problems that come up over time is really another step that I think is often overlooked at this stage, but really should be hashed out because it can lead to a lot of different cost items. And actually in this step, it can actually lead you to go back and fix problems that you had in previous steps with setting the system up. So those are the steps involved. It's a high level. I could go much more depth, but I'm already probably about double the time that I'm supposed to have. So that's my presentation. I very much enjoyed the class and working with you guys. Thank you to all, and I wish you the best in your endeavors.